Breaking tonight, a confidential memo slipped out through an access to information request has revealed something Ottawa never planned to announce. NATO has quietly asked Canada to build the only sixth-generation satellite ground station in North America. Not in Washington, not in Virginia, not anywhere on American soil. The alliance came to Canada, and the documents prove it. Dear viewers, what you are about to hear is not a routine procurement story. It is a map of the new transatlantic alliance forming behind closed doors, and Canada is sitting at its center. The memo is dated December. It was signed by Stephanie Beck, then the most senior permanent official inside Canada's Department of National Defence. Addressed to the Defence Minister, marked for the highest level attention, and then partially obtained by The Logic, the Canadian outlet specializing in defense policy, through a Freedom of Information request that revealed exactly which conversations had been happening and exactly who had started them. The proposal is simple in language, but enormous in implication. NATO wants to build a state-of-the-art satellite ground station on Canadian soil. The facility would link directly to the alliance's so-called sixth-generation satellite communications system, the next leap in military space infrastructure that NATO will rely on for the next 2 decades. There is currently no such facility anywhere in North America. The closest one sits in Kester, Belgium. 2 more are scattered across Europe. The 4th is in Turkey. None in Canada. None in the United States. None west of the Atlantic. Translation: NATO has decided that the most powerful military alliance in human history needs a new Western anchor, and it is not asking America. Let that sit for a moment. For 70 years, the assumption was automatic. Whenever NATO needed to expand westward, radar lines, listening posts, missile defense, satellite uplinks, Washington was the first stop. American territory was the default. American bases were the foundation. Canada played a supporting role, often celebrated, sometimes overlooked, but always alongside the United States. There was a station in Nova Scotia until more than 20 years ago. It became obsolete. It closed. Nothing replaced it on the Canadian side of the Atlantic. That long absence is now ending, and the assumption that the United States is the natural host of Allied infrastructure is ending with it. The documents obtained by The Logic are unusually direct. They confirm that NATO came to Canada with the request, not the other way around. Lieutenant Pamela Hogan, a national defense spokesperson, has now confirmed publicly that Ottawa and NATO are conducting a joint feasibility study. The location has not yet been chosen, but the political decision, the trust decision, has already been made. And here is the part Ottawa is too polite to say out loud. This is happening because the alliance no longer believes it can rely exclusively on American territory. Donald Trump's return to the White House last year has rewritten every assumption in Brussels. He has resumed his old rhetoric about NATO members not paying their share. He has openly questioned the alliance's value. European capitals have spent the last year quietly rebuilding contingency plans for what NATO looks like without the United States as the indispensable host of Allied infrastructure. Canada is the answer to that question. Dear viewers, do not miss what is being said inside that memo. The defense documents argue that as Allied reliance on space-enabled capabilities increases, the resiliency and geographical distribution of ground infrastructure become essential to safeguarding these critical assets. Read that sentence twice. The word that matters is resiliency, and the word that matters even more is distribution. NATO is not just adding a station. NATO is building redundancy that does not depend on American goodwill. If you are watching this channel, you understand what that means. Stay with us. This is the story that is going to define the next decade of North American defense. The geography itself tells the story. NATO currently runs 4 ground stations. 2 decades ago, there were more than 20. Technology shrank the network, but the war in Ukraine, launched by Russia in 2022, exposed the cost of that shrinking. Fewer stations meant fewer redundancies. Each one became a higher value target. Industry reporting has long noted that ground station operators have the technical means to reroute traffic across continents in real time. But legal authority to actually do so often takes weeks. In a hot war, weeks is a death sentence. So NATO is rebuilding the network, quietly, carefully, and it has chosen two new locations to expand into: northern Norway and Canada. Norway is obvious. It sits on the Russian doorstep, with deep Arctic experience and a long history of hosting Allied surveillance assets. Canada is the more interesting choice, because Canada is not just another European adjacent NATO member. Canada is the second largest country on Earth, controls the longest Arctic coastline of any NATO state, and sits directly between American strategic infrastructure and the polar regions where the next great power competition will play out. If you wanted to build a NATO satellite network that can survive a Russian first strike, a Chinese cyber attack, or an unreliable Washington, you would build it in Canada. And here is the detail that should land hardest. Even the Heritage Foundation, one of Washington's most influential conservative think tanks, whose policy blueprints have shaped multiple Republican administrations, has acknowledged in writing that Canada is the only NATO member other than the United States located in North America, not Europe. That concession comes from an American conservative institution, not a Canadian one. When the alliance needs a Western anchor outside American soil, Canada is the only ally that can provide it. That is exactly what is now being planned. The timeline inside the documents is revealing. The conversation began last fall. Senior Canadian defense officials traveled to The Hague to meet the chief of NATO's Integrated Mission Services Center, the agency that operates the alliance's satellite communications. The man on the other side of the table was John Blyth. And here is the detail that explains so much. John Blyth is a former Canadian public servant. He spent years inside Canada's Defense Information Technology bureaucracy before moving to NATO in 2024. The man who came to Ottawa with the request to host a ground station was Ottawa's own former colleague. More meetings followed. A tour of NATO's main satellite ground station in Kester, Belgium, for the visiting Canadian delegation. By December, the memo was on the defense minister's desk. Translation: this proposal did not arrive cold. It arrived through trusted channels, designed by people who understood exactly what Canada was capable of contributing. The financial structure is generous to Canada by any reasonable measure. Canada provides the property. NATO's communications agency pays to build the station. Other alliance members contribute what the documents describe as a substantial amount to operating it. The federal defense assessment is explicit. The project produces a net economic benefit to Canada. Money flowing in, not out. Jobs created, not exported. Expertise built on Canadian soil, retained inside Canadian institutions. But the financial gain is not even the most important part. The strategic gain is. Because Canada is not just receiving a NATO station. Canada is using this NATO project as a training ground for its own multi-billion-dollar military satellite program. The Enhanced Satellite Communications Project Polar, yes, the project actually has Polar in the name, is the Canadian Armed Forces' new system to guarantee secure communications throughout the Arctic. In December, the federal government hired MDA Space and Telesat through a small initial contract that is expected to grow past $5 billion in coming years. Let me put that in plain English. Canada is building its own sovereign Arctic satellite network. The NATO station gives Canadian engineers, technicians, and military operators the chance to train on the most advanced Allied space infrastructure on the planet before Canada's own system goes live. The skills transfer, the expertise compounds, and when Canada's polar satellites are operational, the country will have a sovereign military space capability matched by only a handful of nations on Earth. If you are new to this channel and you want to understand how Canada is quietly building a middle power identity that does not depend on Washington. Subscribe now, because this is not an isolated story. This is the pattern. Look at what has been happening for the past year. Canada and the European Union deepening defense ties. Canada invited into procurement conversations on submarines, on airborne early warning aircraft, on naval cooperation. Canada positioning itself as the Atlantic country whose territory and Arctic reach can quietly substitute for whichever capabilities the alliance can no longer assume from the United States. And now NATO is asking Canada to host the only sixth-generation satellite ground station in North America. There is a phrase that captures it. Canada is no longer the junior partner in the Western Alliance. Canada is becoming the reliable partner. The Atlantic anchor that does not depend on whoever wins the next American election. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government has not said much publicly about the NATO station. That is intentional. Loud announcements provoke American reactions, and Ottawa under Carney has learned the value of quiet movement. The feasibility study is ongoing. The National Defense spokesperson has confirmed only what cannot be denied. Locations remain undisclosed. Costs remain unspecified. But the direction is now visible to anyone watching carefully. Dear viewers, here is the bottom line. In December, a memo crossed the desk of Canada's defense minister, signed by the department's most senior official, describing a NATO proposal that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Build a satellite ground station on Canadian soil, linking the alliance to its next-generation military communications network, without an equivalent facility in the United States. The proposal came from a former Canadian public servant inside NATO. The financial terms favor Canada. The strategic gains accelerate Canada's own Arctic satellite ambitions. And the symbolism, the documents themselves admit, is the point. The memo ends with a phrase that should not be passed over. The station, once operational, would benefit all NATO allies while demonstrating Canada's continued commitment to NATO. Translation: Canada is being asked to show the alliance, in physical infrastructure, what reliable partnership looks like. And Canada is saying yes. The Nova Scotia ground station that closed more than 20 years ago belonged to a different era. An era when American protection was assumed and Canadian contribution was discretionary. That era is finished. The next ground station will reflect the alliance Canada is actually choosing to build. Strategically autonomous from Washington's mood swings, deeply embedded in European partnerships, and anchored in the Arctic future every great power is now racing toward. Before the next headline breaks on this story, make sure you are subscribed, because the moment the location is announced, the next chapter of Canada's NATO future begins. This is Canada Next. I'll see you tomorrow.